I'm Natasha Heller, a professor in the Religious Studies Department, and I thank you all for joining us this evening. I am very pleased to be able to introduce Jeffrey Nicolaisen, who is currently a Global Fellow at Duke Kunshan University. He graduated from Duke University with a dissertation entitled Equality of Life, Thinking with Multi-Species Relationships in Taiwan. Based on 2 years of participant observation and interviews, his dissertation is a multi-species ethnography centered on the Buddhist-inspired conservation group Life Conservationist Association. His work shows us that Taiwan offers alternative ontologies that challenge Euro-American understandings of both religion and nature. Dr. Nicolaisen is currently revising this research for publication as a monograph. His other publications include The Intersection of Sentient Beings and Species, Traditional and Modern in the Practices and Doctrine of Dharma Drum Mountain, in the edited volume Chinese Environmental Humanities, Practices of Environing at the Margins, and Protecting Life in Taiwan, Can the Rights of Nature Protect All Sentient Beings, in the journal Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment. He's also planning, I believe, a second book project that will be an ethnography of a multi-species community of human dogs and monkeys in Taiwan, informed by case studies of Christian indigenous people in hunting, a recent no-kill law for animal shelters, and Formosan macaques and orchard feeding. As far as I'm concerned, this is an incredibly exciting topic, and I look forward to seeing how this project develops. His talk tonight is titled Inequality of Equalities, the Taiwanese Buddhist Encounter with Liberal Humanism and Taiwan's Indigenous People. So before I turn it over to him, please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A box down below during the talk, and we can also take questions live afterwards. So now please join me in extending a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Nicolaisen.
Thank you, Natasha, for that kind introduction. Let me start out by sharing my screen. So just give me one moment. Okay, does that show up okay? Okay, looks good. All right. Thank you again, Natasha, for that introduction, and thank you. I'm really delighted to be able to present today, and thankful for technologies like Zoom that allow me to present at the University of Virginia while I'm actually located in China right now. So, you know, the pandemic has caused a lot of suffering, but it's also opened some opportunities for exchange globally, and so I'm really delighted to be able to present from afar today. And thank you so much to the East Asia Center at University of Virginia for sponsoring the event, and thank you for Brian's support in planning everything. So as Natasha just mentioned, today I'm going to talk about Inequality of Equalities, the Taiwanese Buddhist encounter with liberal humanism in Taiwan's indigenous population. So at the heart of this question, or at the heart of this presentation, is the question, what is equality? And I heard from Natasha that some of the students in her seminar were able to read a couple of my publications, which she just mentioned. And they focus specifically on human equality and equality of life. I'm just going to give a brief background here, what I go into in more detail in those publications, and then go into more of the ethnographic part of my dissertation on the question of hunting in Taiwan, and in particular in relation to indigenous people. But first I want to look at human equality, and particularly the human equality of someone we all know, John Locke, and what the basis for that is. And then to look at another form of equality, equality of life. So as we know, human equality is the basis for human rights and liberal democracy, and very much of the government structure and international law that's prevalent today. Equality of life has not achieved the same level of legal recognition. But I want to put these two types of equality on equal grounds, which is where the idea of inequality of equalities comes from. These are two different ideas of equality, but on a legal basis, they're not necessarily treated equally. And what I want to do, the tool that I use to do this is ontological analysis. So the intent of what we may call the ontological turn is to look at different ontological systems symmetrically, or in other words, to put them on equal terms. So for example, Buddhism, Christianity, liberalism, and something I'll introduce today, the Diane Gaga. I want to put all of these systems of thought on equal terms and compare them from that perspective. In so doing, I will challenge the categories of nature and religion, particularly in Chinese teachings, but also in what could also be considered Chinese, but I don't think that the Diane people would want it to be called that way, in the indigenous practices of people in Taiwan. As part of this, I'll look at the separation of state. And while the separation of church and state is intended to promote the freedom of religion, and it may actually be very helpful for monotheistic traditions, particularly Christianity, as it was created for Christianity. But I argue that for non-theistic teachings, that the separation of church and state and the freedom of religion do not necessarily promote the interests of non-theistic teachings like Buddhism. And then I, through this process, consider alternatives to liberalism, and particularly a type of philosophy based on equality of life. So just briefly to look at John Locke, I am not a European Enlightenment scholar necessarily, but John Locke is someone that has had an inordinate impact on our current legal situation. And so I look at him through the work of other scholars, such as Jeremy Waldron, a legal scholar, who says that we rarely ask what the justification of human equality is. I mean, for now, at this time period, we basically assume humans are equal because we're raised to think that way. But at the time of John Locke, that was not the case. The inequality of humans was the basic presumption in society. Nobles, as compared to serfs, had different statuses in society, and that was considered natural. And so at the time, Locke was very progressive. And Jeremy Waldron says that Locke still makes the best case for human equality. But he also argues that Locke's argument for equality is inseparable from Christianity. So what is the argument that John Locke makes? Basically, Locke argues that God bestowed rationality on humans, and only humans, so that humans would have the capacity to know him, to know God. And only when we know God does virtue arise. Because without knowing that there's a God exists, we have no idea that there's someone that is holding us to account for our actions. But once we know that there is someone that holds us to account, then we will be virtuous. And so an atheist cannot truly be virtuous. And an atheist may be human, but without having deduced that there is a God, he has not fully realized his humanness or fully realized his virtue. So even for Locke, it doesn't appear that his criterion actually make all humans equal. It makes all those that believe in God equal. And at the time that he was creating this idea of equality, it's well known that he was advocating for things like the right of pursuit of property, which was to occupy the lands of Native Americans in the New World, and also investing in companies that were exporting slaves from Africa to the United States. So in his own practice, all humans were not necessarily equal. So what is an alternative then? Once we realize that human equality may be based on Christian assumptions, well, Shi Jiahui may not be as well known as John Locke, but she's a very influential Buddhist activist in Taiwan who promotes equality of life. And just to give her a brief introduction, she's a Buddhist nun and the co-founder with Xingguang Fashi of the Buddhist Hongshi College, which was originally founded by the students of Inshun, maybe the most influential Buddhist monk in Taiwan. Inshun has passed away, and from the very beginning, Shi Jiahui and her partner Xingguang were basically running the organization. But she also established a separate organization, or co-founded it, along with a local Rotary Club and some Christian pastors, but mainly her followers in what was then the Buddhist Hongshi Study Group. This organization is called Life Conservationist Association, and it primarily supports animal protection. But as you can see by the name, animal is not in the name, it's called life, or in Chinese, Guanhuai Shengming Xiehui. Their idea is to support all life. So they don't necessarily separate non-human animals from human animals. So they also promote anti-gambling and other movements that are intended to help human animals as well as non-human animals. Now she's a professor of religious studies at Xuanzhang University and is putting a lot of time into that. But she's still very vocal on issues, not only on animals, but very vocal on gender issues, defending Buddhism, and a variety of things. So what is the alternative form of equality that Shi Jiahui proposes? Here's one quote of what she thinks of human equality and the Enlightenment philosophy behind it. Compared to Christian theories that God, humans, and animals have different statuses, the Buddhist theory of equality among sentient beings provides a strong theoretical foundation for treating humans and animals with equal kindness. So if we're to treat humans and animals with equal kindness, what is the foundation for this? And basically, Shi Jiahui says there's three forms of equality. And these are not things that Shi Jiahui came up with. She's defending Buddhist notions. The equality of life has a history, especially in East Asian and Chinese Buddhism in particular. The first form of equality, which I think provides the most convincing and probably the most fundamental foundation for Shi Jiahui's equality, is the equality of all sentient beings. Basically, very similar to Peter Singer's utilitarian argument, is that anything that suffers is equal. To have the capacity to suffer or to feel the light, we could say, is equivalent to sentience. And so she's particularly talking about sentient beings here. And anything that has the capacity to suffer is a sentient being and is therefore equal. That's the basic criteria. In her second form of equality, the equality of nature of dharmas, she says that all things arise from causes and conditions. So she actually rejects ontology, even though I'm using that word ontology here today. She rejects all ontology in the Aristotelian sense that it's the fundamental nature of being, of the fundamental nature of life is ontology. She rejects that there's any fundamental nature or essence of all things because they're all caused by causes and conditions, and they change constantly. Because all things arise in the same way, based on causes and conditions, they're all equal in that regard too. And finally, there's the equality of Buddha nature, which basically says that all sentient beings are able to become Buddhas. So again, we're talking about sentient beings here. And whether it's a bedbug or a human sage, they're all equal because they all can become Buddhists. Although there can be some hierarchy here. So she argues that if you are in a situation where you do have to prioritize one life or another because some lives come into conflict sometimes, you would prioritize the one that is closer to Buddha nature. So the sage before, say, the bedbug, for example. So today, with that background on equality, I want to get more into my ethnographic data. And so I want to start out by introducing my study site. And I should say to start out with that I'm studying the Diane people, that's spelled T-A-Y-A-L, pronounced Diane. But I don't speak the Diane language. Pretty much all Indigenous people in Taiwan now speak Chinese. And so that's my mode of communication with Indigenous people as well. So I tend to pronounce the locations in Chinese rather than the Indigenous language. So the site that I study is a hamlet called Tianpu in Chinese. And just to give you a little bit of background about Taiwan, the Indigenous people primarily now live in the mountain areas. And in Taiwan has the highest mountain range in all of East Asia. These are very rugged mountains. And even though China claims that there's a history that Taiwan has been part of China, during the Qing dynasty, the Qing occupied Taiwan for the first time. They claimed all of Taiwan, but they never occupied the central mountain range. It was too difficult for the military to conquer the mountains, on the one hand because the mountains are very rugged, and on the other hand because they were headhunting Indigenous people there, which were very fierce warriors. So the Qing never were able to actually occupy the central mountain range. It wasn't until the Japanese came in the early, well, after 1895, when they won Taiwan in the Sino-Japanese War. But that war was between China and Japan and not the Indigenous people. So after the legal recognition that they controlled Taiwan, they had to occupy the central mountains. And they did it using modern warfare, carpet bombing, all kinds of things that was able to overcome the advantage of the rugged mountains that had protected the Indigenous people for so long. So the Diane village that I studied is at a elevation of 1,000 to 1,200 meters. And you can see in this picture here, the kind of rugged mountain range. This is an actual picture of farmland next to Tianpu village. It's about, in 1978, the first road was built to Tianpu from the lowland areas. And up until 1978, it was a 10-hour walk to the nearest market where you could buy rice and food and other kind of manufactured products. So until 1978, at least, people in Tianpu lived a very traditional lifestyle with bamboo huts and an existence of subsistence based on agriculture, gathering, and hunting. Now the village cultivates tomatoes as a primary cash crop. They have a co-op form to kind of collectively manage their tomatoes and sell them in Taipei. But they also grow cabbage, peaches, pears, and persimmons as cash crops, as well as growing much of their own food themselves. So the practice of Ganga is central to Diane culture. As I mentioned, the Japanese started, it was around 1910 that they started a 5-year campaign to occupy the central mountain range of Taiwan. And they declared success in 1928. But even in 1930, the Sedic people, which are and were at the time part of the Diane, famously rebelled against the Japanese in the Musha Rebellion. So the indigenous people were the last resistance to Japan, and even the National Party respects them for that resistance. But their practice up until the Japanese conquest was based on hunting. So whereas in the Diane language, Gaga means law, and if you look at how it's applied, it's the law of the country. If you look at how it's applied to Christianity, the 10 commandments are called the 10 Gaga. And so this literally means law, just like Dharma in the Buddha Dharma means law. And their law was practiced by headhunting. In fact, Gaga means to implement Gaga and basically referred to the headhunting practice. For example, headhunting was used for many, many purposes, like, for example, to resolve a dispute. Two parties involved in a dispute would send out hunting parties, and the first one to get ahead would basically communicate to them that their ancestors supported that side that was the first to successfully hunt a human head. Or it was used, a young male had to hunt to be married, to get the full status as a man. He had to be part of a party that was involved in a successful headhunting mission. Women, on the other hand, needed to learn to weave. And I'll show you a picture here of the tattoos that they put on their face when they became male and female, and that enabled them to marry, and then also qualified them to pass the rainbow bridge to the other world upon death. And headhunting in this way was a way to communicate with the ancestors. There were other ways to communicate with ancestors, particularly through a bird called the cecil or the silic, depending on the dialect of Diane language. And you would read the flight patterns of this bird, and the bird could fly back and forth between the land of the ancestors and the world here, and communicate between the ancestors. And part of Gaga is also hunting restrictions, seasonal restrictions on hunting, no hunting to excess. You have to eat anything that you hunt. You can't let anything go to waste. And hunting is also regarded, success in hunting is regarded as a reward for good moral behavior. So if you were to argue with your wife, for example, or your wife said, we're too busy right now, you shouldn't go hunting, but then the man goes hunting, then he's not going to have success because he's not respecting his wife and his family. So here's the picture I mentioned. When either males or females became adults, they had these tattoos tattooed onto their face. And so what I'm interested in this talk is what Gaga thinks about non-human animals. And there's actually multiple versions, I think, of this attitude towards animals. I mean, we have to understand that before the Japanese occupation, in the mountains, people lived in bands, and there's many different indigenous nations. Right now, there's 16 that are recognized. There's at least 10 that are non-recognized because lowland tribes have never been recognized by Taiwan. But even in the mountains, there's more than 16 languages. In fact, I think there's 23 distinct languages. And even within a language group, there were isolated bands. And so the organization of indigenous society was based on watersheds. So you would have bands, and then bands within a particular watershed would form an alliance. And then people outside of their watershed would be enemies. In fact, Diane people would call Japanese and Americans or foreigners people, but the other indigenous people they had blood feuds with, they wouldn't even call people, they just called enemies. So basically, that gives background to the idea that when you talk about Gaga, there were many Gagas depending on the band. And so when I talk to different people, you get different versions of Gaga. And the one that I encountered first was through the work of Lin Yiren when I was first kind of getting into studying the Diane people. And Lin Yiren's work talks about uh, uh, an elder named Masa Tahui, who was Diane, and he said that when a hunter, when a successful hunter and a respected hunter crosses the rainbow after his death, the Rainbow Bridge, he goes to to the land of the ancestors, and he takes with him the spirits of all of the animals that he hunted. So humans and non-humans are bonded through the act of hunting. And when they get to the other side, the hunting continues. The ancestors still hunt in the ancestral lands as well. And so Lin Yiren, uh, he also talks about the difference between Shijiahui and the Diane people. And he proposes this as a place where the Buddhists and the indigenous people can come together, because in reality, according to Masa, these animals have a soul. They cross the rainbow bridge together. There's a form of equality. So it could be a place to start conversation. But when I went into the mountains and I talked to local people and asked who are the elders that I should talk to about Ganga, I found two elders that were recommended to me, one chief and one Christian pastor. And they both gave me a different story. I thought that they would tell me that, yes, the animals passed the Rainbow Bridge along with hunters, but they said, no, the animals don't have souls, and so they don't pass with the hunters. And so I don't know if this is because of the Christian influence, which I'll talk later. It could be a change in time. It could be a difference in location. But then I found resources published by the Taiwan Diane Language and Culture Research and Development Association, an association with the mission to promote Diane culture, not only to revive Diane culture among Diane people. Some of their materials are published in the Diane language, so they're only available to the Diane people, but they're also published in the Chinese language, so they're available to Taiwan people. So the book, The Rainbow's Judgment, is in both Chinese and English. So they're also looking at the international community and promoting their culture to the international community. And when I look at these resources, again, I see more of what we could call the equality of life. In the book, which is a children's book by Limui Aki, Aki presents, for example, a story of in very early times when humans lived in harmony with non-humans, so that the wood from the forest would present itself to humans. It would just walk into the village, and if you were thirsty, all you had to say was "ja ja," and the water would pour itself into your container. And if you were hungry, you say "cha cha," and a boar would show up. And you would take one hair from the boar and put it in a bamboo container. You would cover the container and open it up, and there was all the meat that you could eat for that meal. But then one day there was a greedy woman, and she said, you know, we always eat just enough. We always get just enough for our meal, but I want more. I want to eat more. So she called Cha Cha, and the boar showed up, and she cut off his ear and put it in the pot. But this time the boar ran off, and he talked to the other animals, including the king of the deer, and they decided, we're not going to support the humans anymore. If they want to eat, they're going to have to find us in the forest, and they're going to have to use their toil and labor to hunt and get food. So there's kind of a falling that looks very much like the Christian tale and may have been influenced by Christianity in the telling. But what's remarkable is that in 2019, there was a film also called The Rainbow Judgment, based on Limui Aki's children's book. And in this, you see the telling of some of the stories of the Buddha of the Diane people. And the Diane people have a very important ancestor who in some way may look like a god, but he was originally a hunter, and his name is Buddha, which is kind of funny because it's just like Buddha, like the Buddhist Buddha, but his name is Buddha. And in the Rainbow's Judgment, he explains to a boy who has just visited his grandma. He's from Taipei, but he went into his indigenous village where his family comes from to visit his grandma. And he goes out and he gets bit by a poisonous snake and has a dream. And in the dream, he meets this great hunter, Buddha. And Buddha explains to Dahui, the boy, that all living things are equal. And as he has just hunted a wild boar, and he explains that the wild boar sacrificed himself for the people, but you have to thank the wild boar because all living things are equal. So at least at a public level, the Diane people, through this organization that promotes their culture, are promoting their Gaga as equality of life, but a different type of equality of life, an equality of life based on killing rather than based on non-killing in the Buddhist sense. Even during the Japanese occupation, headhunting was normal. So it was true that non-humans were hunted, but also humans were hunted. So hunting was something that was practiced for all sentient beings, for these people. So there was a sense of equality in that practice. But now the Diane people are primarily Christian. After the Japanese used headhunting to as a way to manipulate the indigenous people, to be able to control them. They encouraged the different indigenous tribes to fight against each other. And through this process, being manipulated by the Japanese, what was originally a great honor, the practice of headhunting, became something shameful because it was part of a colonial practice. And so the practice of headhunting ended very quickly in the 1930s. But following that period, having lost the traditional practice of Gaga, they had to remake themselves. And recreating an identity involved becoming Christian. So whereas the Nationalist Party did not allow Han people to go into the mountains because they were afraid that if Han people went into the mountains, they would organize rebellion against the government. So they maintained the mountains just for indigenous people. But they needed to appeal to countries like the United States, who could provide protection against the communists, against the Maoists. And so they thought one way to do that was to privilege Christianity. And so they allowed Christian missionaries to go into the mountains where even Han people could not go. And these Christian missionaries provided food and medical supplies to the indigenous people. And out of gratitude, the indigenous people became Christian, but it was more of a materialistic Christianity. They were receiving gifts. And even now they admit that in the beginning, this was kind of a transactional Christianity. But in 1972, it changed. I mean, the missionaries had basically left. The churches were kind of falling apart because they didn't have the donations they had. They weren't receiving the food and gifts that they received from the missionaries as much anymore. But in 1972, in the village that I studied, Tiempu, a woman named Siwas begins, she's possessed by two spirits, one evil and one good. One, I guess, is a Holy Spirit and one is a demonic spirit. And she has to fast for 40 days to resolve this situation. And she finds that if she doesn't spread the message that she receives from these spirits, she gets very sick. So she has to spread the spirit, the message. And when she does so, she shakes violently and she speaks in tongues and all these things happen. And people carry her from village to village where she prophesies. And in 1972, when this happens, not only Siwas, but 6 other women begin to prophesy. And they prophesy that this new charismatic revival movement that they're starting will spread across the world and spread Christianity across the entire globe. So at this time, the Christianity is really naturalized and it becomes a deep faith among the Diane people. But the pastors use it as a new identity. So whereas they were enemies with the other indigenous people before, indigenous people are converted by the Christian missionaries. And this becomes a new identity in opposition to the Han, who they consider colonizers. So what Christianity does is create a new identity for the indigenous people. But in opposition, like they see this colonization happening and the Han culture they see in their communities, even if Han, even now, up until the 1970s, Han were not allowed into the mountains because they could plan insurrection. But even now, now it's more like these are reservation systems for the indigenous people. And the way they see Han coming into the communities is through other species. So I call it a multi-species colonization of Jianshe Township. I heard many stories of the Han people coming and releasing dogs. And this is not necessarily a formal release of life ceremony that the Buddhists call fangsheng in Chinese, but can be Buddhist inspired. So people get dogs, they find out that can take care of them. If they have some Buddhist belief, they may think, I don't want to kill the dog. And they think the dog has its own karma to work out. So they want to release it into the wild to a place that they think is appropriate for it. And so they go to the mountains. Monkeys, on the other hand, I've heard reports of people saying Tzu one of the most famous Buddhist organizations in Taiwan, that's not necessarily famous for release of life. In fact, they do very little release of life, but people report that Tzu volunteers came to this place that I have a picture here in Chinese called Yulao Buluo. This is a place between the front mountain and the back mountain. It's at a ridge, at a crest of the mountain. Many tourists stop here on their way into other tourist destinations inside of the mountains. And so it's a very public place. If people release animals here, it'll be seen by many people. But I hear stories that Tzu people came and released monkeys, chimpanzees, or monkeys the size of chimpanzees, and poisonous snakes, which is the most shocking. I called the local police station, and the police officer said they never received formal reports, and they did not know about the poisonous snakes themselves, but the police officer had heard similar rumors in his own community, and he had inquired into it, but he was never able to find any proof that this actually happened. And even though they claim it was Tzu, one of my research assistants, he was Tzu, he was raised in a Tzu high school and very close to Tzu, and he asked, were they in the uniforms of Tzu, which are very well known in Taiwan, and the people weren't sure that they were in uniform. So I don't know if these were Tzu volunteers that released snakes, but there are cases that are well documented where poisonous snakes are released in Taiwan, and primarily by a Buddhist organization called Chinese Life Protection Association, which sounds to have a purpose very similar to Life Conservationist Association, but actually has a very different character. The founder, Shi Haitao, admits to releasing poisonous snakes in a video I found in 2009, and he defends renunciants who released cobras in Miaoli at that time. And there's another famous case in 2012 where Haitao's followers released cobras, 70 kilograms of poisonous snakes in Ilan. And what was different about this case is that they were kind of bragging about it on social media. And so that it was documented in that way. And Haitao and his followers believe that once you recite the sutras to the cobras, they'll no longer bite people. But most Taiwanese people don't agree with that. And many indigenous people find this to be an extremely threatening practice that threatens their own personal safety in their villages. So in terms of law on the release of life, there's basically no law restricting release of life in Taiwan. The Wildlife Conservation Act prohibits the release of protected species, which are usually endangered species that are native. So if you were to import non-native species, they would not be protected under the wildlife conservation law, or if you were to release animals that are not endangered. But things like the cobra or the Chinese moccasin, these poisonous snakes, some of them are listed as protected species. But there's negotiations going on, but religious organizations have pushed back against regulating this practice. There will be regulations coming, but there has to be a negotiation between religious organizations and the government to come up with some acceptable practices. And there are some innovations going on, ideas like releasing like rehabilitating injured animals and releasing them back into the wild, or releasing only native species which fit into the ecosystem. On the other hand, many Buddhists like Shi Jiahui object vehemently to the practice of release of life as it's practiced. In fact, she evokes a very vivid metaphor with the one country, two systems policy in China. She says that religion has been comparable to an area outside of the sphere of civilization. And so religion gets special treatment. And she thinks that they should be, that these religious organizations should have to comply with the same laws other organizations. In other words, they should not be allowed to do the release of life ceremony in the way that they're doing it. Not that she doesn't believe in release of life. She says that releasing birds and land animals and releasing aquatic animals is comparable to a giant heap of merchandise. Long ago, the Buddhist sentiment of sympathizing with all life was twisted and distorted by a utilitarian mindset. So she supports the idea of compassion towards releasing life for the purpose of helping it, but against the kind of ritualized release of life, which can be actually harmful to non-native species that are released into habitats where they're only going to starve and die and suffer. So now I want to look a little bit at Diane Hunting at my study site. The Diane people at Tianpu are similar to other indigenous people. Most indigenous people in Taiwan prefer 4 types of games. Wild boar is probably their most famous. The Reeves muntjac, which is a small type of deer, and the Formosan serow, which is a kind of mountain goat, and the Formosan sambar deer, a large deer. These are the preferred game species, but only the wild boar has been continuously categorized as general wildlife, so allowed to be hunted according to the Wild Conservation Act. The other 3 have been protected under Class 3 rules. The Reeves muntjac was recently reclassified in 2019. Hunting law in Taiwan has been based largely on the American model. Before 1972, animals were completed as resources, treated as resources. They were not highly regulated. So you start to see drastic depopulation by 1972, when the government decides there needs to be a moratorium on hunting for 3 years. Of course, as I already mentioned, there was no road to Tiempu in 1972. Indigenous people at Tiempu were relying on hunting as a part of their subsistence practice. So there was no way that they were going to be not hunting. They needed to do it for survival, but it criminalized their traditional way of living, both from the cultural side as well as basic subsistence. At the same time, in 1972, the National Park Law was passed. And this basically took indigenous land, designated a national park, and then banned hunting within the national park, ignoring the fact that the indigenous people used hunting as part of their cultural practice and part of their subsistence. And then you get more comprehensive legislation in 1989 with the Wildlife Conservation Act, modeled on the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. It adapts a model where non-humans are treated as resources. Only humans are equal. Non-humans are resources, which follows this Lockean concept of separation of God, humans, and non-humans. They adopted scientific naturalism based on an Enlightenment perspective, predominant scientific naturalism, and there were no exceptions carved out for indigenous people. So the wildlife conservation law was one of the first things that the Life Conservationist Association wanted to change when they formed in 1993. They organized an eco-conservation alliance to ban trade in rhino horn, and they lobbied for US sanctions through the Pelley Amendment, releasing data, which was a very controversial move at the time. LCA allied with the ECA to draft, they completely rewrote the wildlife conservation law. They retained the CITES structure, and this is a demonstration of how to get things to happen politically, to be successful in lobby, you have to adapt the prevalent legal standards at the international level, which was the CITES structure, based on a human equality, non-human resource perspective on the relationship of human animals. The goals of Life Conservationist Association was to control the trade of wildlife and products made from wildlife. They believed if there was a market for it, that would perpetuate the practice. And so they wanted to end trade in wildlife products. And they also wanted to prevent domestic breeding of wild animals for a similar purpose, because it would create a market. They did carve out an exception for indigenous people to hunt, but only in traditional ceremonies. So once or twice a year when they had a ceremony, they could hunt, but they still prohibited traps and snares, which were the most common way of hunting for the indigenous people. So now I want to look at the separate legal movement for indigenous people. So while the environmental movement was gaining steam and the Buddhists were getting behind it, and they were beginning to take ownership by drafting an amendment, Life Conservationist Association took ownership of the Wildlife Conservationist Association, which was originally drafted by the government. And so Buddhism becomes kind of the face of colonialism, at least in the area of hunting in that way. But the indigenous people want to push back against colonialism. And so in the 1980s, an indigenous rights movement forms along with the international indigenous rights movement. It was supported by early legislation or early international agreements on labor organizations, which allowed some hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering as a form of labor and qualified people to receive compensation for it, indigenous people in particular. The Convention on Biological Diversity in Article 8 also protects traditional lifestyles relevant for conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. But it was really in 2007, with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, that indigenous people were successful in creating a statement of rights at the international level. Taiwan could not participate, although the indigenous people could participate in the United Nations as they received recognition in 1991. So in a way, Taiwan wants to support the indigenous people because they want to be a player in the international arena, but they can't be because they're not officially recognized as a country. So recognizing the indigenous people is one way that Taiwan could get recognition and give them influence in Taiwan. And so prior to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People passing in 2007, Taiwan passed the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law. And the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law legalized hunting wild animals, collecting wild plants, wild fungus, minerals, rocks, and soils, using water resources by indigenous people, and for the purpose of conducting traditional cultural ritual or self-consumption. But now there was a conflict. So the Indigenous Peoples Basic Law was promulgated later than the Wildlife Conservation Act, but it did not repeal the Wildlife Conservation Act. So it created a conflict between the two laws that needed to be adjudicated in the courts. But judges tended to favor the Wildlife Conservation Act. So indigenous people continue to hunt, and for the most part, they hunt without repercussions. But there is arbitrary enforcement of the Wildlife Conservation Act, so that when police go into the mountains and decide that they want to catch a hunter, it's easy for them to do so. And so they needed a test case, and they got one in 2013, the case of Tamatalum, a Bunan hunter who was caught hunting a Reeves muntjac. He said that his mother was sick, and he wanted to get some fresh meat for his ailing mother. So he captured a Reeves muntjac. He was arrested. He was sentenced to 3.5 years in prison and fined 70,000 Taiwanese dollars, which is approximately 2,200 US dollars. And he was found guilty of violating the Wildlife Conservation Act, as well as the Controlling Guns, Ammunitions, and Knives Act. This was challenged and brought to the High Court by his attorney, Chen Sai. And the sentence was suspended in 2017 until the Supreme Court could give a constitutional interpretation. And as of, I was last aware, that has not been resolved yet. So there's still a conflict between these two laws. So this is an act of, can be seen as an act of colonialism on behalf of Buddhists. I mean, Jia Hui uses this language, I think this pragmatic language very clearly here, just by returning to the basic aspect of humaneness. The anti-hunting campaigners could instead oppose blood sacrifice and meat eating. And here she's referring to blood sacrifice rituals in Han society and meat eating in Han society. Then couldn't the pure and honest indigenous people become our comrades? However, in terms of campaign strategy, so this is the pragmatism, that would cause us to make enemies with a greater population than the indigenous people, meat-eating consumers and the following of popular religion, causing anti-blood sacrifice and anti-meat-eating campaigns to fail alongside anti-hunting campaigns. So she's basically saying, as a political strategy, she's working on the hunting campaign because the indigenous people have less political power than the Han people. Otherwise, she would go after all meat eating and animal sacrifice. On the other hand, the Presbyterian pastor that I interviewed in the village, he says, so according to the state's conservation, if a Chinese moccasin enters your house, you can't kill it. You can't kill a poisonous snake. If it is in your house, we will definitely kill it. We protect people, we don't protect snakes. We protect animals, not those threatened and endangered species. So what you see is both sides using human equality to fight their case. On the one hand, you have the Buddhists who are allying through a secular organization with people like Peter Singer, secular philosophers, and Christian pastors to get legitimacy in the secular realm, separating the Buddhist Hongsha Institute from the Life Conservationist Association so that they can have the legitimacy of a non-religious organization. And then from this secular place, arguing on the one hand for the protection of religious freedom, for the release of life ceremony. These religious organizations argue for their protection through the release of life. Life Conservationist Association appeals to their protections for non-humans. And indigenous rights they're appealing to the protection, even though indigenous people were originally oppressed by people like John Locke, who claimed the Native Americans and indigenous people were not protected. They appeal to indigenous rights through the Declaration of the Rights of Rights of Indigenous Peoples to gain back their traditional culture. So the interests of non-human animals in this disagreement are never appealed to directly. Both are arguments based on the protection of religion or the protection of cultures in a liberalist hegemonic system. But the equality of life presents a different alternative. To talk about ecological policy, not just in terms of human rights, but in non-human rights. So in terms of the equality of Buddha Dharma, it emphasizes the prohibition on killing, and the equality of life of Diane's Gaga is characterized by hunting, but also a different type of equality based on killing. But at least this discussion of equality of life, whereas the Dharma and the Gaga may have different versions, it attributes value to the non-humans so that the value of these can be discussed directly through ecological negotiations. So to come to a compromise, both sides need to comprehend the ontology of their opponent and then master the political maneuvering of a hegemonic system based on the Christian liberalist system that was created in the Enlightenment by people such as John Locke. So I'm going to conclude. I think I've gone a little bit over 50 minutes that I had, but thank you for listening. And I'm really looking forward to the questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicolaisen. That was really, really fascinating, and I have pages of notes. And just a reminder that you can either pop into the Q&A that you would like to make offer a question, or you can actually just ask the question in the Q&A. So either you could say that you'd like to ask a question and I can unmute you, or you can ask the question in that form. And I think we have, as people are thinking, someone had, I think, a question. Can you see these as well? The Q&A?
Yes, I see one question here. Yeah.
So I don't know, do you want to take that? I think it's a question that is addressing, it reads, do you differentiate between life and chi, life force? So perhaps it's a question about what do we mean by is something of light alive, and what is equal when there is a quality of life?
Well, I think that, I mean, we're looking at different cosmologies here. So when I refer to life, it comes from a Buddhist cosmology, and it's based on the three equalities that I discussed. I think sentience is the most important aspect of it. And in Buddhism, traditionally, not all things are sentient. In some ways, there's a way to look at all things as sentient, but to simplify, sentient beings are things like humans, non-human animals, you can have hell beings and hungry ghosts, devas, and so there's these things that are sentient, and there's things that are not sentient. Rocks, grass, most plants are generally not considered sentient. So there's a differentiation in Buddhism. If you talk about qi, qi comes from a different cosmology. This is from a traditional Chinese cosmology, which you could call Taoist, but Confucians believed in it too, and basically it just underlies Chinese thought. I wouldn't necessarily translate qi as life force. Qi is the energy that composes everything, whether it's living or not living. It's basically, it composes matter as well. So these two concepts come from different cosmologies. And so one of the things that I try to do in my research is look at the foundations of cosmologies as different perspectives, equally legitimate in a symmetrical way. And so in this case, I would say that qi and life, as I refer to it, are coming from different cosmologies. I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. Professor Dorothy Wong has also written in, there are now a couple of questions. So I think I will read out the questions and then you can take them and answer them live. Does that make sense? So she asks, the Mongols also have a background as nomadic hunters and are meat eaters. Are there situations with the Mongols and Buddhism similar to the conflicts in Taiwan between Buddhists and indigenous peoples?
Well, I am not an expert in Tibetan Buddhism. There's many Mongols that are followers of Tibetan Buddhism. Not all Mongols, but in fact, I've had students from Mongolia in my Buddhism class and learned a lot about his own practices. So traditionally in Tibetan Buddhism, people do eat meat. They respect non-human life in the Buddhist tradition, but at the same time, as you rightfully acknowledge, they're nomadic hunters, not necessarily nomadic for all Tibetans, but they definitely ate meat, and so there is a movement in Buddhism now among Tibetan Buddhists to move towards vegetarianism, and there's been a debate on vegetarianism in Tibetan Buddhism that goes back several centuries. Jeffrey Barstow has written about this debate. He has a monograph about this. And so I don't know if I can weigh in too heavily on this debate. I mean, I think Jeffrey Barstow or someone that studies Tibetan Buddhism would be a better source. But I would say that one big difference is that Mongolians adopted Buddhism culturally. So they practice hunting along with practicing Buddhism. And so there wasn't the type of conflict that occurs in Taiwan because the hunters are not Buddhist and are practicing hunting and trying to defend it against Buddhists who want to end the practice of hunting. So it's a very different dynamic, I think, in Mongolia as compared to Taiwan.
Thank you. So a couple more questions coming in. The next question is from Chris Rowe. To what extent is Zhao Hui's understanding and application of the Chinese Buddhist idea of equality, pingdang, the same as or different from equality in a pre-modern setting? So in other words, are we talking about the same kind of equality? Do we mean the same thing by that?
I think that's a good question. And it's very difficult to answer. I think that the way that I approach Buddhist studies is that Buddhism is historically situated in a particular time period and a particular cultural context. But that's not always the way that Buddhists talk about Buddhism. I mean, for many Buddhists, there's a correct Buddhism and there's an incorrect Buddhism. So for someone like Shi Jiahui, she's speaking with the authority of Buddhism, and she believes that her interpretation of Buddhism is the correct and original form of Buddhism. And so when she protects the equality of life, that's how she presents it. At the same time, she's also very pragmatic. And so she wants to work with the culture where it is now. So on the one hand, she can support her concept of equality of life with sutras, but she actually uses a different approach, which is to have dialogue with modern philosophers. So what she writes about equality of life is adopting kind of the European version of philosophy to not appeal so much to early texts, which are considered authoritative, but to make logical arguments. And her argument stems from dependent arising. That's the basis that she found. And I think that is a very traditional form of Buddhism. I mean, that's from the very beginning in Buddhism, and it's a very foundational concept in many or most forms of Buddhism. So in that way, she's very traditional. But then she uses discourse to dialogue with people like Peter Singer. So Life Conservationist Association, as I was describing, they want to appeal to a broader audience. They're not looking just to Buddhists. They want to put Buddhist concepts such as equality of life into the law in Taiwan. And I think ideally it would be in international law. So they want to make it palatable to non-Buddhists as well. And that's where they have to appeal to ideas like human rights, equality of human equality, or Enlightenment thinking. And so they find theories of thinking from the Enlightenment to defend their position. And in particular, after forming Life Conservation Association in 1993, one of the first things they did was translate Peter Singer's Animal Liberation. They didn't translate any of the doctrines that you could refer to on Buddhism. They didn't translate sutras. They translated Peter Singer. And Shi Jiahui continues this discourse with Peter Singer. She invited Tom Regan and Peter Singer to a conference in 2014, and then again in 2016. So she's adapting the idea of equality to match with a modern audience and appealing to philosophers in the European tradition to get to a broader audience. And I think that's where you see changes from traditional Buddhism. Although she would say, and she defends that she's completely in line with traditional Buddhism, the language has definitely changed. And the animal protection movement in Taiwan itself is also moving more away from Buddhism in that sense.
Thank you. The next question is from Iksai Go, who writes, since the Diane are mostly not Buddhists, they may have no reason to abide by Buddhist notions of equality of life as espoused by Jiahui. Moreover, Jiahui's firebrand style of Buddhism may not be representative of Taiwanese Buddhism in general. Can you comment on how other Taiwanese Buddhist organizations such as Siji, Guangshan, and Dharma Drum approach the issue of hunting by indigenous non-Han Taiwanese people?
That's a really good question. Shi Jiahui is definitely not representative of all Buddhism, and not all Buddhism in Taiwan. But she's very close to these other organizations. The Tzu Chi founder Zheng Yan, was also a student of Inshun. So they're Dharma sisters. They're sisters in a monastic sense. And so Zhao Hui is also very well known. Like other Buddhist organizations in Taiwan, they want to at least maintain the aura of apoliticism, of not being political. That's how they survive. I mean, when you were in an authoritarian system of government, that they needed to demonstrate that they supported the government but didn't oppose the government. So they didn't want to do anything controversial, but they also could be considered political in a sense that they had good relationships with the government. Like Tzu, the first thing that Tzu really became famous for was building a hospital. And they received the land from the government. The government was looking for this type of support. So they have the other Buddhist organizations have a close relationship with the government, but they want to maintain an aura of non-political, of being non-political. So that's where Zhao Hui is different. She doesn't make any effort to be non-political, and she will defend Tzu when Tzu won't defend itself. And there's a famous case of that, which maybe would take too much time to describe. But you know, like I've spent time at Dharma Drum and Shungyan, the founder of Dharma Drum, and I've also read through Stuart Chandler's work, some work on Fo Guangshan too, and Xing Yun, the founder of Fo Guangshan. I mean, he's very much in line with Dharma Drum as well. Fo Guang and Dharma Drum have a lot of agreement. Shungyan and Xing Yun, they both are opposed to release of life ceremony when it's used in the way that Shi Hai Tao uses it. I mean, just releasing animals, wherever they're from, into whatever habitat is available. They believe, like Shungyan in particular, he proposed that you rehabilitate injured wildlife and release them back into the mountains. So they're very much in line with the idea of protecting life, and very much in line with the idea of equality of life. So not only in Buddhist organizations, but in Taiwan society in general, if you talk about 生命平等, the equality of life, it's very well known, and even among non-Buddhists, very well respected. Not everybody is a vegetarian, not everyone is willing to be a vegetarian, but even among non-Buddhists, like vegetarianism is a practice of gaining merit. So, for example, I met a man at an event that was recognizing the work of a legislator in Taiwan who was retiring. And she supported some environmental movements, which was why I was there, but she also supported the rights of handicapped people. And so I met a man who had a son who was autistic, severely autistic, and he was part of an autism foundation. And he became vegetarianism for his son. He became vegetarian for his son because he thought that he could transfer the merit to his son. He wasn't Buddhist, but he thought that vegetarianism was a practice that would accrue merit for his son. So ideas like vegetarianism, equality of life, are very well received in Taiwan. And that's why I think that the Diane people, they're not just speaking to Zhao Hui. When I talk about the Rainbow's Judgment and this film, which you have Buddha, this ancestor, talking about the equality of life, I think what they're doing there is trying to appeal to Han culture, where equality of life is already a fixture of the political or cultural environment of Taiwan. So if you can create an equality of life, or if you can use this as a tool to sell Diane culture to the Han people, they think it may be well received. So equality of life, although Zhao Hui may be one of the most representative and vocal. Um, it's much more suffused into Taiwan culture than just the political activism of Zhao Hui and Life Conservationist Association.
Thank you. Our next question is from Eben Yonetti, and he writes, it sounds like there has been quite a lot of syncretism between Indigenous lifeways and Christianity among the Diane people you worked with, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit more to this in their religious life today.
Sure. Yeah, syncretism is a difficult word. It's very interesting. I think even though it seems that some practices of Christianity and traditional Ganga are at odds with each other. I mean, the missionaries that came to Taiwan and learned about and saw headhunting um, were very much disgusted by the practice. And so to them, it was very non-Christian practice. But for the Diane, Diane people now think that Gaga and Christianity have no conflict. In fact, they're the same. It's actually very difficult now for me to find Diane people that are not Christian. So it's very hard to ask some questions about Gaga without hearing about Christianity. I mean, when I met with these elders, and I tried to find the elders that were most authoritative on Gaga. The first one was a tribal chief, so he wasn't necessarily a pastor. But the way that I met him was that he asked us to join them at the church service first. And so we went to church and sat through church service. And then after the church service, he welcomed us to his home where he talked to us about Gaga. And the second elder that was recommended to me, he was a Presbyterian pastor already. And he was also considered an authority on Gaga. So for these elders, Christianity and Diane and the Diane traditional culture are completely compatible. But that's not always the case for ordinary people. One time I went to a ritual. So much of the ritual that was part of Gaga has been lost and is continuing to be lost. And part of the indigenous movement is to restore traditional culture, which was lost because it was prohibited by the government. And then because of other factors that, universal education, where you're educated in schools, so the children are educated in public schools and no longer in the traditional way. And so in the last 30 years in Tiempu, you don't see many traditional rituals. So there is a movement within Tiempu to restore some traditional practices. And one of them is to plant millet. Millet was the most important crop for the indigenous people. And they have not been growing millet recently. So planting millet is restoring traditional culture. And when you plant millet, there's a millet planting ceremony. And for 30 years, they haven't done this millet planting ceremony. And you have to take kind of a sacrifice. You have to bury it in the ground. You have to dedicate this to the ancestors. And so I was there, and they got a elder woman to help. First, to separate the millet, because the young people can't even understand the different kind of strains of millet, but then to conduct the ceremony. And she conducted it in the Diane language. And I can't understand Diane, so I had another Diane person that would help to interpret it, but she wouldn't. interpret everything. And instead, she was very concerned because this elder woman would not say the dedication in the same way that it was done traditionally, because she was afraid that it would be a kind of worshiping of idols. The Diane people's Ganga was based on, you could say, ancestor worship, but maybe that's not ancestor worship, because if I talk to people today, they'll say, no, 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 no. Gaga is not about ancestor worship. It's about respecting the ancestors. But, you know, like, if you cannot say, if some ordinary people are afraid to speak the traditional way of saying things, because it could be a violation of their Christian faith, then I feel like there are still some areas where there needs to be resolution. And the pastors are very conscious of this. So they talk and are working on restoring Gaga and making it completely aligned with Christianity. And that involves some reworking Christianity and some reworking uh, the Gaga, which is very interesting because they believe in both. And the idea that they're consciously talking about reworking it acknowledges that there could be some conflict. So it's an ongoing project.
Thank you. We have one question, and I think I'm going to piggyback on this question and make this our final question from, pardon me if I mispronounce this, Ray Tikria. We've got another question that's coming in. So maybe we'll just these last two, and then we'll wind up for the evening. Asks, how would you describe a sentient being? And I might add to that, you've been talking about non-human animals, the bigger ones, right? Like I think mostly mammals, some birds and fish. But what if we get down kind of on these smaller types of animals, and or into sort of bacteria and things like that, things that might be sentient but are not sometimes what we think of, different forms of life that might have sentience. And are these part of the discussions of the Diane people, or Zhao Hui's protect, life? Does that include her life protection, include those kinds of lives as well?
Yes. Okay. So that's a good question, and it's a very disputed question within Buddhist studies, and so there's definitely different questions. And I mean, when I talk about sentient beings, in Chinese, the word is zhongsheng. And this is a word that the Buddhists use, but the indigenous people don't use. So although indigenous people are starting to talk about equality of life, they don't talk about sentient beings in quite the same way. So I think in responding to the discussion of sentient beings, I think this is more a question about Buddhism than the Diane Gaga. But for Shi Jiahui, I mean, she's looking at this mode of existence of, the six paths of existence. One of the paths is animal realm. So if you ask about bacteria, for example, like bacteria is not part of the animal realm. So I don't think that she would consider bacteria. And she talks about plants specifically. And I mean, it's very interesting to see that she says that the way that she expresses it in her writing is like, plants don't have the same amount of sentience as animals, which suggests that they could have sentience. But then she finally concludes that there's very few schools in Chinese Buddhism that recognize the sentience of plants. So she basically concludes that plants are not sentient, although they should still be respected. Like there's some vinaya against like cutting down trees, for example. So you still have to respect plants, but you don't have to protect their life in the way that you do other things. So there's two words in Chinese. One is shengming and one is zhongsheng, and both of them can be used. That I translate both as equality of life, because the sheng in both means life, and zhongsheng tends to be more translated like sentient beings, and shengming seems to be more of a secular way of talking about life, and both are used, but Buddhists would tend to use zhongsheng more. And if they want to make their idea of equality of life more palatable to non-Buddhists, they may use shengming. So in that respect, zhongsheng is sentient beings, which is the animal realm. So it would include insects, and Zhao Hui does talk about insects like cockroaches. You shouldn't just randomly kill cockroaches. If you accidentally step on one, that's fine. You didn't have intention, but you wouldn't intentionally go to kill it. So I think when we talk about sentient beings, it's very much focused on the animal realm for Zhao Hui.
Thank you. So the final question is from Scott, and it is, given the inequalities of equalities presented, do different conceptualizations of time, cyclical or linear, have an impact? And do these just different conceptions of time play into the discussion between the groups, or a possible resolution? And if they do, how would that happen?
Not so much. I mean, I guess it would get into Christianity to some extent. In Gaga, there's no story of the creation of the universe. It just was kind of there already. There's a creation of humans, like humans come out, there's different stories. In one story, humans come out of swine manure, just like a woman and a man appear out of swine manure one day. In another one, they come from the top of a mountain in a crevice. They just pop out of a crevice. But the idea was that there's no creation story of the universe. So I guess we can assume that it was just always there, which is very similar to Buddhism. There's not really a creation story. And I don't really see, I haven't seen in my reading of cosmology, of Diane cosmology, anything cyclical. I mean, yes, there's annual cycles of the crops, but in the legend, in the stories of the ancestors, no, I don't really see a cyclical sense. But where there may be a different conception of time is in Christianity, since so many indigenous people have adopted Christianity. And there is a teleology in Christianity. There is an eschatology in Christianity. So there is an end point. And there's a difference with that with Buddhism, because Buddhism doesn't really have an eschatology so much in the same way. There's not a beginning of the universe like there is in Christianity. There's not an end of the universe like there is in Christianity. I mean, you could talk about nirvana and kind of the extinction of the universe, but I still think that's a little bit different. But I don't think that time is a major factor in the conflict between these ontologies.
Well, thank you again for taking all these questions and for what a really rich and fascinating talk that I know that I'll be thinking about for days to come. And I imagine that many in our audience will be as well. So, if you can sort of join me in a kind of virtual applause for Professor Nicolaisen, and thank you all for coming and for joining us here at University of Virginia East Asia Center. For this wonderful talk. So thank you again, and good night.
Thank you.